Aloha and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the second virtual session of the US-Japan Cyber Forum, Strengthening International Cooperation Through Cyber Diplomacy. Held with support from the US Embassy in Tokyo, the US-Japan Cyber Forum is a three-part webinar series focusing on three interdependent themes that underpin US-Japan cyber cooperation: defense, diplomacy, and development. Our current project builds on the successful outcomes of Pacific Forum's US-Japan cybersecurity cooperation beyond the Tokyo 2020 Olympics held in August 2021. To kick off our latest endeavor, we held the first virtual session of the US-Japan Cyber Forum titled Advancing Cyber Defense and Resilience in the Age of Strategic Competition. In that session, we analyzed the current tempo of cooperation between the two allies given the drastic changes in the international environment. Salient points from the first session revealed that heightened strategic competition and gray zone activities have prompted the allies to ramp up their cybersecurity capacity building and bureaucratic restructuring to counter state-sponsored cyber threat actors. According to its 2022 Digital Defense Report, Microsoft saw a sharp uptick in cyber attacks against critical national infrastructure, especially information and communications technology entities, corporate firms, non-governmental organizations, and research institutions in the US, UK, Israel, Switzerland, Japan, Australia, Germany, India, and Canada. And in addition to long-standing advanced persistent threat campaigns, Russian cyber influence operations are also on the rise due to the ongoing war in Ukraine. The increasing intensity, severity, and sophistication of cyber operations have led the US and Japan to coordinate more closely. They are expanding their recognition of adversarial capabilities beyond the binary of peacetime or wartime. On the US side, election security concerns, coupled with growing momentum for a more proactive approach to cybersecurity in the 2018 Department of Defense cyber strategy, were pivotal for US Cyber Command's new operational approach called persistent engagement. Japan is also undergoing a dramatic shift to further strengthen its cybersecurity. It has been more vocal in revamping its cybersecurity posture, known as active cyber defense. Despite their respective institutional and operational challenges, the US-Japan alliance holds the potential for even greater collaboration in cybersecurity based on a shared understanding on the need to proactively contest rather than just react to cyberspace threats. The full key findings of the first session are now uploaded via Pacific Forum website and could be accessed through the link shared in the chat box below. Building on the key insights during this first session, today's webinar, US-Japan Cyber Forum, Strengthening International Cooperation Through Cyber Diplomacy, we will examine the implications of US and Japan cyber diplomacy efforts at the regional and multilateral levels. As the two allies are involved in key technical and policy training in the Indo-Pacific, today's session will evaluate ways on how they can improve and harmonize their approaches to cyber capacity building to achieve synergy and ensure long-term impact. Speakers will also assess how Tokyo and Washington are cultivating trust and transparency and building confidence among key partners and stakeholders in government, industry, academia, and civil society, given the rapid shift in Japan's cyber policy to adopt active cyber defense and the US sustained resolve towards persistent engagement. Finally, this session will probe vital lessons learned from cyber capacity building exercises conducted jointly or separately by the US and Japan alongside like-minded states amid challenges stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as well as North Korea, Iran, and China's use of cyber operations to achieve economic and strategic ends. Before we jump to our discussion today, allow me to share some housekeeping rules. Please note that remarks made in today's program are on the record, and a video audio recording of the session will be made available on the Pacific Forum website and social media in the future. This session will also include feedback and Q&A with the audience, and participant cameras are disabled throughout the session. However, during our Q&A discussion, participants will be allowed to unmute their mics to ask questions or give feedback. Note that participants, you may submit questions in the Q&A box as we have them during the presentations. We also have interactive features like polling as we go along. We ask that everyone answer our poll question to warm up our discussions. Our first poll question for today is, Given the drastic changes to US and Japan's respective cyber policies, which area should the two countries prioritize in their cyber diplomacy efforts to maintain trust and transparency and increase cooperation? Support for practical confidence building measures among key partners in the region. B, promote cyber norms and the application of international law to advance responsible state behavior in cyberspace. C, integrate elements of economic security to combat cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. And last, D, counter disinformation and misinformation campaigns. So while we wait for the results, I'll note that we also have a survey we would like you to complete after the event concludes. Please find the link to the post-event survey in the chat box now. Promote cyber norms and the application of international law to advance responsible state behavior in cyberspace got 36%. It's followed by integrate elements of economic security to combat cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property and trade secrets. And both tie for third place or ranking in third, support for practical CBMs among key partners in the region and countering disinformation and misinformation campaigns. So it would be interesting to see how the views from our audience change as we go through the discussion today's webinar. So thank you so much for answering that poll. And leading the discussion today will be Akira Igata Sensei. Akira Igata is a project lecturer at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo. He is also an adjunct senior fellow at Pacific Forum, a non-resident senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a director of the Japan Association for Cellular Agriculture, and a non-executive director at the Interparliamentary Alliance in China. He advises the Japanese government, bureaucracy, and the private sector in various capacities. His research interests include economic security, human rights diplomacy, cellular agriculture, and international politics in the Indo-Pacific. Igata Sensei, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your kind introduction. So for the second session of the US-Japan Cyber Forum, Strengthening International Cooperation through Cyber Diplomacy, I'm happy to introduce our three panelists today. First will be Mihoko Matsubara, Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at NTT Corporation in Tokyo. Second will be Wilhelm Vosse, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at my alma mater, International Christian University, ICU, also at Tokyo. And then Dr. Benjamin Bartlett, Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science in Miami University. So our first panelist, Miho Matsubara from NTT, has previously worked at the Japanese Ministry of Defense before completing her master's at the Johns Hopkins SAIS as a Fulbrighter. Most recently, she was the Vice President and Public Sector Chief Security Officer for the Asia-Pacific region at Palo Alto Networks. She is an Associate Fellow at IISS, Adjunct Fellow at the Pacific Forum, non-resident scholar at SPF USA, and a Cohort 6 member of the US-Japan Network for the Future. Mihoko has also published a Japanese book on cybersecurity in 2019, which has won the Okawa Foundation for Information and Telecommunications Award. Well, Miho, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me today. So I'd like to share my Japanese industry perspectives, especially after how the national security strategy will promote Japan-US cooperation on cybersecurity and also Japanese domestic efforts to enhance our national cybersecurity capabilities. So the last year, Japan had two very important strategy package and also legislation. The first one is Economic Security Promotion Act released in May 2022. So the legislation had four main pillars: security of critical infrastructure, more resilient supply chain, public-private partnerships on emerging technologies, including cybersecurity, and ensuring secret patents. And all of the four pillars cover somewhat cybersecurity. And this will promote the Japanese national cybersecurity capabilities from economic security perspectives. The second crucial national strategic package was released in December 2022, namely National Security Strategy. And for the first time, the Japanese government included the new concept of active cyber defense in the new national security strategy. And I know that it is also a very confusing concept because each country or each organization or even every individual has a different definition of what active cyber defense means. But in the Japanese case, it means that the Japanese government tries utmost efforts to minimize the damage caused by cyber attacks, even they do not constitute a part of armed attack whenever it comes to threaten the national security. And also, they indicated that the Japanese government tries to eradicate the cause before those grave cyber threats are happening to the Japanese critical infrastructure services. So it is really interesting. So how come the Japanese government decided to include the active cyber defense to protect Japanese critical infrastructure, even if those cyber attacks will not constitute part of armed attack? So I think it is because we saw what happened after the Colonial Pipeline incident caused by a ransomware attack in May 2021. So even though that financially motivated cyber criminals can shut down the operations of crucial critical infrastructure services for multiple days, and they can threaten national security or even international security. Because a ransomware attack or a wiper attack can impact on the greater part of our international supply chain. And the supply chains are so globalized, and they can impact national or international security. So we have to think about it, even though that those attacks caused by either a ransomware attack or wiper attack can threaten our national security, even though that they do not constitute part of armed attack. So what we can do actually to pursue active cyber defense. So I think one of the lessons we are learning or observing from the ongoing war in Ukraine is that how the Ukrainians have been successfully cultivated and also enhanced the resiliency of their critical infrastructure and also the robustness of cybersecurity. And they did their efforts on their own, but also they had greater support from the international community and also the tech industries. So according to the Financial Times article dated March 9, 2022, a US team consisting of the US Army Cyber Command and also multiple US private companies went to Ukraine in October to November 2021, a few months before the invasion of Russians. And they searched the networks of Ukrainian critical infrastructure companies because they had believed that already wiper was embedded in the networks of Ukrainians' critical infrastructure companies, even before the actual invasion occurs. And actually, they found a wiper malware in the network of the Ukrainian railway. Do you remember what happened right after the invasion started? 500,000 of Ukrainian citizens evacuated from their own country. And most of them used the Ukrainian railways to flee to the neighboring countries, including Poland. And can you imagine what would happen if they were not able to use the Ukrainian railways if the wiper was actually activated on the day of the invasions? So this kind of the proactive threat hunting efforts to find a wiper or other types of malware sitting in your networks of critical infrastructure will help you to be resilient from grave cyber attacks to disrupt the operations of critical infrastructure companies. And even before the package of the national security strategy was published in December 2022, the Japanese government and Japanese self-defense forces and also the Japanese Ministry of Defense had already started to enhance their cybersecurity capabilities. Did you actually know that it was the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces that hosted the first multilateral armed forces cyber exercise after the invasion of Ukrainians by the Russians in February 2022? So they hosted the first multilateral cyber exercise, inviting the United States, France, Australia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And they invited Germany, but they are not able to make it because it was only like 1 week into the war, and everybody was too busy to react to this invasion. And reportedly, the joint cyber exercise focused on the discussions on the hybrid warfare, which has been occurring in Ukrainians between the Russians and Ukraine. So I am so proud that the Japanese Ministry of Defense and also self-defense forces were able to provide a trusted environment to discuss this crucial issue, even though that they must have been really busy to respond to the invasion. And to be able to pursue active cyber defense to protect the Japanese critical infrastructure companies, you have to do joint exercises to make sure that you know how to respond and what to prioritize. And again, even before the national security strategy was released back in December 2022, the Japanese Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces already started this type of exercises. So the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence hosts an annual cyber exercise since 2010. And even though that Japan is not part of the NATO, but Japan is a full member of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence over the last few years. And for the first time, the Japanese Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces joined this locked sealed exercise in 2021. And Japan teamed up with the United States in 2021, and also the United Kingdom in 2022. And both the United States and the United Kingdom only invited their armed forces or Ministry of Defense. However, did you notice on this slide that the Japanese Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces actually invited not only themselves, but also the civilian agencies and also the critical infrastructure companies? Why? Because to protect critical infrastructure companies, you have to have a public-private partnerships, and you also have to have partnerships with civilian agencies because they have stewardships and responsibilities to protect their own area of critical infrastructure. So, and I'm so glad that even that Japan, it was the first time for the Japanese Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces to join this locked sealed exercise back in 2021. But it's really encouraging to see that they already saw the needs and the importance to bring in civilian agencies and critical infrastructure companies in the collaboration with the United States and the United Kingdom. And I really hope that they will continue to do so this year and next year as well. So, okay, so the Japan has kicked off a really good start to protect critical infrastructure companies and also to be more resilient against grave cyber threats. And also the Japanese Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Forces already started now international and also domestic public-private partnerships to protect critical infrastructure. And Japanese critical infrastructure companies are important not only for the Japanese themselves, but also for the United States and also like-minded countries. Why? Because the Japanese critical infrastructure companies also plays a crucial role to provide services for the US forces in Japan and also the trading partners. So it means that Japan is responsible for protecting critical infrastructure services for the international community as well. And the Japanese government, specifically NISC, hosts an annual cyber exercise over the last 17 years to make sure that Japanese government and industry can respond quickly to the disruptions to critical infrastructure services. And I believe that it will be a good idea for the NISC to start inviting the Japanese Ministry of Defense and Self-Defense Forces to create Team Japan to ensure that the whole nation will have a good understanding of the division of responsibilities and also to enhance the resiliency of Japanese critical infrastructure. And maybe we can learn lessons from Taiwan's annual military drill, Hanquan exercise, because at least over the last 3 years, they started to invite critical infrastructure companies to ensure the resiliency of critical infrastructure services as part of the annual military drill. And to do that, it means that we cannot only focus on cybersecurity. Of course, cybersecurity is really important, but maybe we should do not only a cyber exercise, but also multi-domain exercise. Because if any conflict or war occurs, as we are seeing in Ukraine, the warfare will happening across domains. So that is why Japan and the United States started integrated exercises to cover multi-domains through Kingsword and also Yamasakura last year. And they cover cybersecurity as well. And more importantly, at least the Kingsword invited Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdoms. And they may not have covered the multi-domain exercises yet, but it is an important step forward to expand the capabilities to be more resilient in multi-domains.
So Miho, your time is over, so if you can wrap up.
Okay. So I think that Japan has already made an important and great steps forward, and I'm really looking forward to working with you more closely to do better in terms of cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miho, for that comprehensive explanation of Japan's cybersecurity diplomacy. I have a couple of questions I would like to ask you later on, but just to highlight a few before we go to our second speaker, Miho. On ESPA, you mentioned that all 4 pillars of the ESPA is relevant for cybersecurity, but later on, if you can talk a little bit about how cybersecurity is relevant to the supply chain pillar, as well as the secret patents pillar of ESPA, that would be great. Another question I would like to ask you later on is, when you talked about the significance of the new national security strategy, you didn't mention what I consider as one of the most important developments related to cybersecurity in the document, which is the restructuring of the cybersecurity headquarters NISC. or the National Center for Incident Readiness and Strategy for Cybersecurity, because they basically said that they're going to restructure NISC and establish a completely new organization, which would be in charge of engaging in comprehensive coordination of cybersecurity. So once again, later on, I'd be interested in hearing a bit about what you think this new cybersecurity headquarters should look like. So now we would like to move on to our second panelist, Wilhelm Vosse. Professor Vosse teaches at ICU, where he also serves as the chair of the Department of Politics and International Studies. He has held visiting research positions at Harvard, Oxford, and the University of Warwick. His research interests include Japanese foreign and security policy, EU-Japan security relations, cybersecurity, and cyber diplomacy. He also is the academic coordinator for a project funded by the European Commission, the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet Network on European Cyber Diplomacy. His recent books include Japan's New Security Partnerships, published from the Manchester University Press, and New Directions in Japan's Security, Non-US-Centric Evolution from Routledge in 2020. Professor Vosse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think I will share my slides after all, so if that's okay. So I hope you can see that. I was given a few questions, and I will try to be as brief as possible to answer these questions. So one of the first questions was, what are the implications of the war in the Ukraine towards cyber norms and the application of international law in cyberspace? I mean, the first thing that I would say is obviously that it's too early to say whether the Ukraine war had specific effects on cyber norms yet at this point. This is basically the solution or the recommendations of the UN group of government experts in 2015 when they came to an agreement. There are basically 11 non-binding norms that states should basically agree to. Just focus on 3 of them in red. You can see them here. Prevent misuse of ICT in your territory, which eventually at the end of the day also means that the country from which an attack is launched also has a certain responsibility for what happens to the country, whether it's a state actor attack or it's an attack by a non-state actor. Or do not harm critical infrastructure, or do not harm emergency response teams. So bringing us back to Japan, Japan has been very active in designing and shaping cyber norms. Japan has been an active player in the United Nations group of government experts, for example, and in recent years also in the open-ended working groups. I will obviously, for time reasons, not go into any details here. Japan is strongly supporting the Paris call and basically the standard that norms and state responsibility in cyberspace. So basically that when there is an attack from the territory of another country, for example, then this country or this government of the country does have some responsibility, although the country itself or the attack itself might not be a government-sponsored attack. The general philosophy or the general principle that Japan stands for is basically that international law applies in cyberspace. And of course, it shares this principle with the US, with European actors, and with many other Western actors as well. And the second one, that Japan is in favor of defending a free and open internet to protect democratic and anti-authoritarian values. And I'd like to come back very briefly to that a bit later in my slides, so because that's kind of more important. So in 2022, the UNGGE basically had their last successful, or 21, sorry, the last successful meeting in 2017 that were not successful. This is basically, these are a few quotes from a statement, the Japanese government statement in response to this, and I will just focus on a few issues here. So basically that there's a shared understanding regarding which activities in cyberspace constitute a violation of international law. So this is the Japanese statement here, and which will deter malicious activities in cyberspace. Japan has been a proponent and basically has developed this idea of data free flow with trust. and which is basically the idea that people and users of the internet should basically trust what happens online and should trust the system overall, so that this has economic benefits for many societies as well. And finally, as I said before, international cyberspace attacks by states entail state responsibility. I think state responsibility is a very important part here. And finally, Japan is saying that international humanitarian and human rights law also applies in cyberspace. All of this makes more sense, of course, when you consider that there are a number of countries that are not in favor of this. China and Russia, of course, are prime examples here, and they have a very, very different philosophy as far as the openness of cyberspace and also who should be in charge of regulating the internet overall. Japan is heavily involved in regional cooperation, as I said, with the EU as well. The whole idea of an open, free, fair, stable, and secure cyberspace. Japan, as well as the EU, as the United States as well, considers this as the foundation for social and economic growth. So this is not only, the internet is not only there for sharing cat videos, but the internet is basically almost a human right nowadays. It's basically a necessity for societies to prosper and for economies to prosper. So it's not really something optional. Japan is specifically, of course, working with ASEAN and countries in ASEAN. They have done a number of exercises, tabletop exercises, critical information infrastructure protection, and so on and so forth. Japan has set up the ASEAN-Japan Cyber Capacity Building Center in Bangkok. And there's a long list, basically, of activities. Part of this has to do with protecting the IT systems themselves, so classical cyber security terrain, but it also has to do with cyber crime and cyber crime norms and the protection of the infrastructure and connectivity. And connectivity is a specifically important word for Japan, but also for EU-Japan cooperation. I think for US-Japan cooperation as well. And I'm mentioning the EU here a few times because this is an area that I'm working on. So it's not only the protection of banks and national infrastructure, it also has to do basically with what kind of resources they are using. So how did the Ukraine war change Japan's outlook on cyber warfare? Obviously, what the first answer one could give is a bit too early. I think the very brief answer, or very first shot, would be it's kind of a wake-up call for two reasons. One reason is, of course, especially what we have seen in recent weeks, that this has led to a closer cooperation between China and Russia. The relationship between Japan and Russia has been quite positive for a very long time, with China obviously much more negative. And so this, of course, this cooperation is really highlighting the necessity that countries in the West really need to cooperate to protect this free and open internet as far as possible. And the second one probably also has to do with information warfare. So there is much more than just protecting IT systems against classical, basically technical cyber attacks, but it's equally important to basically have some protection of the information, disinformation, misinformation shared, and so on and so forth. It was already mentioned by Ms. Matsubara, the cybersecurity strategy. Last one was basically passed in 2022. And so I'm, of course, not going to detail here on this, but even this in 2021, so before the start of the Ukraine war, has this concept of active cyber defense. This has a lot, of course, to do with attribution and attribution capabilities. I talked about this last time. So this used to be, and to some degree still is, one of Japan's weaker points. Japan has supported public attributions from the US, in particular from the UK in recent years, but has oftentimes not been able to independently verify or attribute cyber attacks itself. And this has in partly to do with its own capabilities and the lack basically of active cyber defense or offensive capabilities. So basically the knowledge of what happens in other systems. More important here, is probably the last few changes here is the Defense Build-Up Program, the National Security Strategy. And I would just focus on one aspect here of the National Security Strategy, which of course the core concept here is active cyber defense. Dr. Miyoko already mentioned that in the Japanese case, this is basically interpreted as more passive, so basically as an active defense of Japan's infrastructure and not an offensive element. However, if you read the national security guidelines, you can see that it does require ability to develop information gathering and analysis capability in the field of cybersecurity and to penetrate and neutralize attackers, servers, and others in advance to the extent possible. So this does have a certain element of one could interpret this as offensive as well. And there have been discussions in the Japanese Diet about this. So exactly how far the Japanese government would go, and it would be interesting to have a bit more of a discussion on this. I just looked up the basically the amount that the Japanese government has been spending, or the increased amount the Japanese government has been spending. This is basically the Ministry of Defense spending on cyber-related defense budget. You can see that there's obviously a steep increase here over the last few years. I think the data that I got from 2023 is basically the budget that was just discussed, was just basically discussed last week. So this might be increased from the 26 billion there. And so finally, 2 minutes left, Japan's active cyber defense to preserve transparency and trust. So again, Japan is an active actor in cyber diplomacy more broadly. I will skip this one. So I'll skip this slide as well. So Japan is active in capacity building, as I said before, in confidence building, especially in ASEAN, in a number of fora, in the ARF, in particular the Asian Regional Forum, in a number of other fora that Japan is active. I would overall say that Japan is probably one of the most active cyber diplomatic actors in the world, given the size of the country and given the relevance of the country. So dozens and dozens of different fora that Japan is active in. Point number 3, very briefly, I would mention in the last minute, is digital development partnerships. So the one issue that might need a bit more discussion is the problem that in order to help other countries defending their own systems, for example, countries in ASEAN, it is also important basically to have or to advise them, for example, not to buy IT infrastructure from certain companies. Of course, this is the whole debate about Huawei and ITC and other Chinese manufacturers. And this is a bit of a problem where, in some sense, Japan has been kind of successful to convince certain member states or ASEAN member states not to deploy these technologies. In other cases, it has not been. I think my time is up. I had a few more things to say, but I think I will keep this for the second round. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sticking to the time. So I have 2 cats, and I'm guilty of watching cat videos often, so I'll vehemently protect my rights to watch those clips, but I'm also for ensuring open, free, fair, stable, and secure cyberspace as well. So once again, this is a question I would like to ask you during the Q&A session, but you talked a bit about the changing nature of cooperation between China and Russia on the information sphere, and I think that's really interesting. So if you can talk a bit more about the details of this China-Russia cooperation, that would be fantastic. Also, I'd be interested in hearing how Japan, US, and other like-minded countries should respond to this threat of disinformation and influence operation as part of the cyber diplomacy cooperation. So now on to our final speaker, Benjamin Bartlett from the Miami University. He has received his PhD in political science from Berkeley, and he also has a Master's of Science in Computer Science from the University of Toronto. His research interests include comparative cybersecurity policy, cybersecurity in East Asia, and international cooperation on cybersecurity capacity building. He has published in the Journal of Cyber Policy, Asia Policy, and in the Oxford Handbook of Japanese Politics. He also has an article coming out in the Pacific Review on Japanese cybersecurity capacity building assistance in ASEAN. He is also a 2022 recipient of an NEH Fellowship for Advanced Social Science Research on Japan. So with that, Dr. Bartlett, the floor is yours.
Great. I'm going to try and keep my remarks short because I do want to make sure we have some time for discussion. I also was asked to address 3 questions, which I will do briefly. So the first was sort of what are the driving forces behind both the US and Japan's cyber capacity building in Southeast Asia. I'm going to do it backwards and start with Japan. Japan actually first gets involved in Southeast Asia mainly due to sort of economic security concerns. It's very reliant on Southeast Asia in terms of its supply chains, right, in terms of outsourcing. Later, particularly under the Abe administration, it realizes that this also is an opportunity for it to sort of another place where it can play more of a leadership role in Southeast Asia, can really show itself to be a good partner, sort of, again, going along with Dr. Bossier's book, sort of moving away from just a purely US-centric role. And also along with what Dr. Bossier just said, a good way of sort of pushing these cyber norms, right? Its preferred norms in these areas. The US likewise wants to sort of push these norms and also is sort of interested in obviously sort of competing with Chinese influence in the area. I would say that the main difference when you're thinking about priorities between the two of them is for Japan, this is a very big priority, whereas for the US, this is sort of one of many priorities. And so that you do see differences because of that, which actually gets me to the second point. What are the points of convergence and divergence between Tokyo and DC when it comes to cyber capacity building in the region? The efforts themselves in terms of the forms they take look very similar. All right. I mean, it's a lot of focusing on, how do we protect infrastructure, training, how do we develop good policies, things like that. The difference really is in terms of just kind of the degree to which they are participating. Again, for Japan, this is clearly a major important role. I mean, just to give you an idea of just of how different we're talking about. There's currently been, I think, 3 ASEAN-US cyber policy dialogues as opposed to 15 ASEAN-Japan cybersecurity policy meetings, which just gives you a sense of how long each side has been really heavily involved in this. I'm not going to go through everything Japan's doing because actually Dr. Bossier covered a lot of it. But the point is Japan has a whole bunch of different ministries all sort of getting involved in, sort of developing all this cyber capacity in Japan. It's doing a wide variety of projects, everything from building, helping build certs to, security partnerships to helping develop university curricula. So it's just all kinds of stuff. The US is also working on, sort of training, often with Singapore. It's doing some work in Thailand, but sort of more narrowly focused, less sort of expansive than Japan's efforts are in the region. Also, both are developed in cybercrime. And as Dr. Bossier mentioned, they are cooperating originally just with each other, but also now with the EU on sort of building up industrial security as well. The third question I was asked is what concrete steps can they take to sort of make these things better? So as mentioned, we're already seeing some coordination, but I would actually argue that the bigger problem before we get to how can they work better together is more getting more cooperation sort of within the countries, particularly as you do this in Japan, where at the moment, and the Japanese, to its credit, complains about this, so they know it's a problem. Each of sort of the ministries are doing wonderful things, but they're not necessarily doing it in coordination with each other. They're each sort of pursuing their own agendas and sometimes are reproducing each other's work, as it were. And so one of the things that would be actually really helpful for coordination would be getting the coordination sort of within country first, because then you could then work between the two countries. And I should say it shouldn't just be between the two countries, right? If you're going to have the US and Japan cooperating, you need to bring ASEAN in as well. So it should be sort of the US, Japan, and ASEAN talking about these things. But I think before that, it'd be really helpful to have more cooperation within Japan, and maybe this sort of new NISC is a way to get at that. I also just will, as one last comment before we get to questions, I will say too, there's something to be said for a division of labor here, right? Where Japan does play sort of this major role in the region, and maybe the US acts where it has particular special capabilities to do so. I should note too, it's not just Japan of the US's sort of allies that is in this area working on this, right? South Korea is doing things, Australia is doing things. So there's a lot going on here. So Japan, the US doesn't necessarily always have to take the lead on these things, particularly because I think Japan can serve as a useful partner to ASEAN in some ways. Its interests in some ways more overlap with ASEAN's in the sense that they're both really worried about sort of economic security in the region and maintaining a good security thing. Japan, of course, is going to be in the region no matter what. The US's attention tends to vary depending on what administration is in at any moment. That's not really Japan sort of always there. And Japan tends to be at least less overtly focused on competition with China, which I think, that for the ASEAN part is, they don't really want to get stuck in between the, big powers fighting each other. And so for them, sort of that, Japan may be a more comforting partner in that sense. So that's it. Wanted to keep this short, but I'm happy to talk about anything more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that very concise presentation. Maybe one question I want to ask you later on is on this the last part you talked about with regards to the division of international labor. So, of course, this session is about US-Japan cooperation on how to help the Southeast Asian and so on. But like you said, there are other countries in the region too, right? And I think we're seeing a proliferation of regional frameworks these days with the Japan, US, Australia, India Quad, which could be one vehicle. There's also Australia, UK, US AUKUS. Recently, Prime Minister Trudeau talked about having its own quad with Japan, America, Canada, and Korea. And I like to call them JAC because it's JACK. So the JAC quad. There is G7, G7 plus, IPEF. So yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about what you think would be the right vehicle in pushing for coordination in the region other than just bilateral cooperation. So with that, yeah, thank you everyone for your presentations on US-Japan cybersecurity diplomacy. I would now like to open up to the floor for questions from the audience. So for our audience, we request that you either ask your question in the Q&A window or raise your hand in the webinar controls accessible from the participants tab. If you raise your hand to ask your question verbally, the host will enable your microphone and ask you to unmute yourself. To give others a chance to ask questions, please keep your questions short and direct to the point. Also, please be ready to unmute yourself when you are asked to. And while we wait for the questions to come in, we ask that you answer the second poll for today. Jaslyn? All right, so you can read it there. With the evolving cyber threat environment, which of the following options should Japan and the US add to their cyber diplomacy toolbox or initiatives? A, coordinated and frequent joint public attribution of state-sponsored cyber attacks. B, imposition of economic sanctions against suspected state-sponsored hacking groups. C, launching a counterattack or hackback against the perpetrators. And D, reinforce or upgrade current cyber capacity building effort through regular joint cybersecurity exercises. So it's pretty much evenly split, right? So yeah, it's split. So I think all of these are very important for cyber diplomacy toolbox or initiatives for Japan and the US. I think this shows that there's a lot that we need to do. So yeah, I think that's good. Now, since I don't really see any questions yet, perhaps we can start by having Miho, Professor Vose, and Benjamin to answer some of the questions that I raised during the immediately after the presentation. Miho, do you want to start?
Sure. So the first question you asked me is about the Economic Security Promotion Act, specifically the secret patent and also supply chain. So I think that the Colonial Pipeline incident caused by the ransomware attack in 2021 and showcased how important cybersecurity is to ensure the risk management of our supply chain. We used to only focus on physical deliveries of services and products, but also we have to think about cybersecurity. So that is why, well, of course, the Economic Security Promotion Act doesn't only focus on cybersecurity, but I think that clearly that the Japanese government saw that the need to incorporate cybersecurity components into the economic security. And secret patents, well, we are still seeing how the component of the Economic Security Promotion Act will evolve over the next few years. But it seems like that because the crucial emerging technologies defined by the Japanese government include cybersecurity. So I would expect that maybe all of the four pillars would cover some components of cybersecurity. So that is why I included secret parents may play an important role for the better cybersecurity.
Thanks. Yeah, on the supply chain point, my understanding of the law is that the Supply Chain Pillar of Economic Security Promotion Act helps diversifying away some of its supply chains from certain countries to other countries, but it doesn't necessarily talk about how the Japanese government, for example, is going to subsidize increasing the cybersecurity of global supply chains. So I think that's more of a critical infrastructure pillar of it. But what about your take on the new NISC, if you will, that the national security strategy is talking about?
So we do not know yet, because the Japanese government only announced that they will evolve the existing NISC to a new version of NISC. It will be put under the National Security Secretariat. And it seems that they will put more manpower into the new version of NISC. So that's really encouraging. But other than that, we still have to wait and see on how the new responsibilities of the active cyber defense will be put under the new version of NISC.
So if you were the advisor to the government, what would you say? What would you advise them on how this new NISC should look like?
So, well, I appreciate that the Japanese government already knew the importance of the public-private partnerships. The existing NISC already invites cybersecurity people from all of the ministries and agencies, and also critical infrastructure companies in Japan. So it's already that the existing NISC is already a hub of public-private partnerships in Japan to work on the critical infrastructure protection and also supply chain. So I really hope that because active cyber defense will play such a crucial role to play for the protection of Japanese critical infrastructure communities, and it is also important for the international community. So I hope that the new version of NISC will invite national security focused experts as well, because the active cyber defense sounds like, well, we will still wait and see the exact definition, but it seems like it will include it will require the expertise on national security too.
Thanks, Miho. Professor Vose?
Thank you very much. I think you asked me the question what the collaboration between Russia and China would mean for Japan generally and for cybersecurity in particular. I would say in this combination, obviously both countries were the source or were behind a number of cyber attacks in recent years. And Japan, again, has been more straightforward and open to publicly attribute these cyber attacks to these countries. For a long time, they were much more cautious about this. But let me extend your question a little bit, because in this partnership, quote unquote, between Japan and China, most people would say as far as technology is concerned, China is the much more important part. And of course, Japan, not only Japan, but the US and the Europeans as well have been concerned about the so-called digital Silk Road. And so what this means, of course, so the Europeans, but also the Japanese realize that cyberspace IT more generally basically becomes a geostrategic area. So it's not just a question of individual actors, North Korea, Iran, or China and Russia attacking IT infrastructure in other countries. That is standard procedure. We know that, and we have to obviously improve our IT systems. But the bigger picture that is happening, of course, is that China is, of course, building infrastructure itself. In the US, obviously, in the last few days, you had the whole TikTok event, and the whole country was looking at Congress about this. We didn't have a similar debate in Japan. The simple reason is that TikTok is not such a big player in Japan, at least in comparative perspective. But the more broader picture, again, is China. First of all, China is building infrastructure. And if the focus here is on East Asia in particular, of course, then China is building infrastructure, 5G networks in particular, in a number of East Asian countries. And one of the objectives, again, not only of Japan, I guess to some degree of the US and the Europeans as well, is, of course, to basically convince as many ASEAN member states, for example, not to deploy these technologies. But that is very, very difficult because very often these technologies are cheaper, and Huawei is simply cheaper than Nokia or Ericsson or other Japanese manufacturers. So that's a big problem. On top of that, of course, this also has to do with norms, because with technology, of course, come IT norms, not these cyber norms that I talked about before, but basically just technical norms. And of course, the other key word here, and I have to stop this here for time reasons, is this whole idea of digital authoritarianism. And that's basically behind this. So Japan is, of course, equally, and the US, of course, as well, concerned about digital authoritarianism, because the problem is, once this is in place, once you have a certain IT infrastructure in place, this will probably be in place for many, many years, probably decades to come. So once this is in place, it's not only the question of maybe China has a backdoor, this is opening up for cyber espionage, for example, maybe that as well, but it's also basically how the internet works. And my last thing would be basically, to make us aware of that the internet overall, so the internet population has completely changed from 10, 15 years ago, where our image, and probably all of us sitting here, is that the internet is basically English or Western, US-based, European-based, Japan-based. That's no longer the case. 2/3 of the internet population is basically in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a completely different internet. And of course, with that comes a lot of challenges, basically, to what used to be the grandfather and the so-called inventors of the internet, and what the future of the internet will be. So it's no longer in our, if I may say, so the Western hands. So we have to play an active role here. So Japan, the US, the Europeans, in coming up with better solutions so that the internet is not split and we have this splinter net and censorship becomes more normal, and basically state control of the internet becomes the norm rather than the exception. I will stop this here. Thank you.
So very quickly on TikTok, back in 2020, there's actually a LDP committee that were talking about banning TikTok in Japan. It didn't happen, obviously. But then now, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago, the same LDP committee has once again come up with a recommendation saying that perhaps we should ban TikTok as well. So there is a brewing discussion in Japan as well. Now, I've been informed that we can extend the session by 10 minutes, so we have 10 more minutes. So Dr. Bartlett, if you have any answers to my questions, then please.
Good answers to your question is the more important one. So which is the right vehicle is a really good question. I mean, if we're talking about capacity building in ASEAN, what's the ideal is different, but what's realistic, right, is ASEAN is going to want to be the center of it, right? Because they don't want, that's their thing, right? They want ASEAN to be the most important sort of body in the region. They're not going to want to look like they're siding with the US against China, right? They're not going to want to get caught up in that. And likewise, the US and China are not going to cooperate. So like something like the G20 would be great, but how do you get everyone on board? I think something like you could potentially, though, see something regionally, right, with maybe like ASEAN, Japan, Australia, South Korea. I mean, honestly, even Canada would be better than the US, right, from this perspective, where you might get more sort of cooperation between sort of those regional powers that aren't great powers, right? And they could say, look, what we're here to do is essentially is explicitly work on improving sort of cybersecurity for infrastructure and critical, these critical connectivity and things like that, and not, this is not about wider geopolitics. So that something like that might actually be effective.
Thank you so much. So we do have one question from the floor, and it's not really addressed to anyone specifically. So if one of you can pick this up, that'd be great. I'll just read it out. In the recent past, I have heard that the US had concerns about sharing certain intelligence with Japan, considering it to be the weakest link regarding security leaks. Has Japan alleviated such concerns by addressing its own capacity to keep sensitive data safe from cyber intrusion? So does anyone want to take this up? Oh, go ahead, Dr. Bartlett.
You could also answer this, but I guess I will. So the US, so it's absolutely true the US has these concerns. There's that rumor is correct. Japan has been working quite a bit in terms of including passing sort of this, the very controversial security law under Prime Minister Abe to try and assuage U.S. concerns. So Japan has been making a lot of efforts in this regard. It takes a long time and a lot of work to change minds in the U.S. government. So I think there's more work to be done. But I mean, I think it's just a difficult problem for Japan. I mean, I think Japan wants to sort of have that same level of Five Eyes. I think it would be very useful for Japan. I think Japan is trying very hard and taking some real, I mean, the government took some real political hits in order to achieve this. So I think it's showing that it's serious about this. But I think it's going to be, take some time before the US kind of really changes its mindset about Japan. It tends to be slow to change its mind about things in the government.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Sure. So thank you for the question. So as Dr. Bartlett stated, so this goes to not only to Japan, but also to any countries to share sensitive intelligence. And it can be, well, the leakage can occur by cyber intelligence, but also by human weaknesses. Or one of the bad example is Snowden. So I think that what we need to do when we are working on the Quad and also the new Quad, including Canada and the G20, G7, to cover cybersecurity in addition to other traditional economic, trading, and security issues. What Japan needs to do is to ensure the transparency of the processes that Japan is working on to enhance information security, not in addition to cybersecurity. Because if we do not talk about what kind of efforts we are making internally and also by legislations, how we can ensure the confidence and trust from other international partners, including the United States. So that, because information sharing goes both ways. It doesn't work if it's only one way forward. So that is why Japan needs to convince the United States and other like-minded countries that here, Japan is making efforts and progresses in terms of the legislations and policies, etc., that we are enhancing the resiliency and also the data security.
All right, so thank you very much to all of the panelists. Thank you for your questions from the audience. And most of all, I'd like to thank Pacific Forum and especially to Mark for organizing all of this. With that, I will now return the virtual floor back to Mark.
Thank you very much, Kurigata Sensei, for co-hosting and helping us lead this discussion today and also moderating today's session and for those fantastic questions. I hope we have more time, but it's always great to have to leave you all wanting more, so you can tune into the next, the final virtual session of the US-Japan Cyber Forum that will be focusing on development, particularly on the implications of emerging technology and standard setting and norm setting and other initiatives to shape the global internet. And the final webinar of the US-Japan Cyber Forum focusing on development. And on behalf of Pacific Forum, we thank our panelists, Mihoko Matsubara, Dr. Benjamin Bartlett, and Wilhelm Posse. We'd also like to express our appreciation to the US Embassy Tokyo and the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo for making this event possible. I'd also like to remind our participants of the post-event survey form, which we will share again in the chat box now. We would really appreciate it if you would take a few minutes of your time to complete it and share your feedback, as we want to make sure that future sessions are engaging and productive as possible. The last virtual session, again, of the US-Japan Cyber Forum will focus on development, and we hope that you'll continue staying engaged with Pacific Forum programming, which you can find out more on our website at www.pacforum.org. Please stay tuned for more details by subscribing as well to Pacific Forum or following us on social media. I am Mark Brian Manantan, Director of Cybersecurity and Critical Technologies at the Pacific Forum. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Mahalo and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.